78 years after the US dropped a nuclear bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, the site hosted a G7 summit where instead of taking concrete steps to talk about peace, the US and its allies chose to ramp up rhetoric of a new Cold War against China and Russia. Why was that horrifically violent act of 1945 not enough for us to give peace a chance? The US has also signed a defense and maritime surveillance agreement with Papua New Guinea, the Pacific island nation, during a visit by top US diplomat Antony Blinken. Washington is aiming to counter the influence of China in the Pacific region, and the US says the deal was drafted by the two nations as equals and sovereign partners. So then, why are the young people in Papua New Guinea out on the streets in protest? And the World Health Assembly is underway in Geneva, is likely to be the epicenter of the battle for universal global health care, not health coverage, waged by health practitioners and activists around the world, and the interests of rich nations on the other side, big private health providers and big pharma. Jyotsna Singh of the People's Health Movement is reporting from Geneva for the Daily Debrief. We ask her what health activists are likely to be most vigilant about as the discussions on the agenda points begin. First up, the 49th Group of 7 summit took place this past weekend in Hiroshima, in Japan. As you would be well aware, the summit lasted from the 19th to the 21st of May and included leaders from the G7 grouping: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and of course, the United States. They met, talked, and released a communique that ramps up aggression towards both Russia and China. Peace movement has voiced its disappointment that the G7 leaders did not use this opportunity to put forward any serious proposals to resolve the ongoing war in Ukraine and establish a lasting peace, but rather doubled down on their commitment to prolonging the conflict. Instead, also, the US and its allies appear intent on provoking another major conflict with a major power, China. Prabir, NewsClick's editor-in-chief, is with us in studio now to talk more about the subject that we've been discussing on Daily Debrief for the past few episodes. Prabir, we'll carry on from where we left off yesterday, which was focused on Russia in the context of the G7 statement and its lack of actual substance in talking about issues of peace, at least. And China is very much a part of that broad idea of not pushing for peace, but actually what this statement, for example, says that we do not want a Cold War with China. What is your take on things as they stand today?
Well, anybody who starts by saying, I do not want A or B or C, the argument is actually he does want that. Otherwise, why was there a need to say that? So the question is whether they want or do not want a Cold War with China in terms of words. The fact is, over the last few years, we have had two things. A, the recognition from the G7 and the G7 countries, NATO, that China is the main competitor in Asia. So that has been there. And the increasing recognition, it is the major competitor economically in the world with the United States. It's really, post the Second World War, the United States has been the dominant economic power. That is being challenged by China. And today, as we have discussed earlier, the major trading partner of 80% of the countries in the world today is China. 20 years back, it was the United States. So the economic focus has shifted to China. And also that it is really what we are discussing is commodity trade. So commodity trade, this is what the relationships are. The US still controls the money. So therefore, financial power of the United States is much bigger than what the trade figures will show. But the change over there is if, for instance, technology, the fulcrum of technology in the world shifts to China. As of now, the United States still controls, shall we say, the most advanced technologies in the world, which is electronics, which is artificial intelligence, software, biotechnology. These are the really cutting-edge technologies today, and the US still has a dominant position in that. Can that change? So this is the context within which we are talking about what is the economic competition. And there the words in the communique, G7 communique, is very interesting. It says we are not decoupling, but de-risking. But this is English, If by de-risking, are you saying you're going to move your supply chains away from China into safer shores like, for instance, India, Europe, and so on? So what does this really mean? What's the difference between decoupling and de-risking? This is what I would call the philologist's world. No, I'm not getting into that. But the real issue is that you are really talking about moving a lot of your industrial imports away from China into other countries, and therefore it's a continuation of what's called friendshoring. So given that, what is likely to happen? Yes, it's a clear economic competition that the G7, and we've talked about this being the old boys club. This is the colonial powers, the settler colonial powers.
There's a new one for it. It's the Unloved Leaders Club.
Well, the unloved leaders, because the hegemons are not liked or loved, okay? And the ex-colonial powers are unlikely to be loved by the colonies or the ex-colonies. So this is the picture that we have. So it's really the continuation of friendshoring, decoupling, by other words, you know. That's what we seem to see. And the other issue is, of course, Taiwan. And as you can see, tensions over Taiwan, etc., the South China Sea continues.
The other aspect that came out of this G7 meet was that while some of the emerging economies, India, Brazil, etc., were invited and present, it's uncertain how much kind of importance was given to their agendas and the issues that are important to these countries, as well as space, obviously, to participate in the wider conversation. In the context of China, how do these countries, the BRICS grouping and other regional groupings that we've spoken about on Debrief in the past, where do they come in this wider sort of global relationship?
You know, they came in very prominently only in the photo ops. So if we had the photo ops, yes, Modi was there, Lula was there, and so on. But in the communique, we did not see any engagement with anybody else except what the G7 wanted. So that is one part of it. So for countries which are today, the BRICS countries, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries, a lot of the ex-middle powers trying to be now economic powerhouses in their own right. And this, of course, applies for both Brazil and India. India is aiming to be the third largest economic power in the world in 20, 30 years. If we take all of that, we don't really see, apart from the decoupling or de-risking kind of argument, there doesn't seem to be any place for them. And that's not true for, obviously, Brazil either, because Brazil is very much part of continuing its cooperation and trade with China. So India and Brazil could have been used as intermediaries in peace talks on Ukraine and Russia, partly because if they do not want to give that salience to China, then these were countries which might be better interlocutors for them than, for instance, China would be. But we didn't see any move towards that. Zelensky, in fact, didn't even meet Lula. So given that, I think these powers do not seem to have played any major role in any of the major issues that were discussed. One was Ukraine, the other was China. None of this, there is much of a engagement we can see with any of these two countries or the other countries which are called there. I think the biggest tragedy for me, Hiroshima is the nuclear bombs. With Ukraine, with the tensions on Taiwan and with China and the United States, we are back to again the nuclear threats, escalation without being able to control it. Biden talked about the silly issue of balloons, but the silly issue of balloons is what caused the US to not have Blinken go to China. So given that, to call it silly issue about balloons now, when China was saying, what is this? This is basically a scientific balloon which went out of control. Why are you making such a big issue out of it? And as you know, after shooting it down dramatically, we've got no revelations of what the major issue was that the US media went. The US media went gaga over it. They went ballistic over it. And now to call it silly balloon issue is rather strange. So there is no, in that sense, no attempt to have a rapprochement with China either. And in fact, what you see in this communique, China has reacted quite strongly to it.
Yeah.
So I think this is violating the spirit of Hiroshima. And let's not forget, the Hiroshima was not the end of the Second World War, as the United States claims, because Japan was quite willing to surrender uh, as long as you protected the emperor, which finally the United States did. But the United States did not give the guarantee before Hiroshima and Nagasaki because they wanted to test the new weapons they had. And as people have described, this was not the end of the Second World War, but the beginning of the Cold War. And that's why the two nuclear bombs. So I think it's a violation of the spirit of the Hiroshima movement that was built for world peace around it.
Yeah.
That no discussion on peace took place, but it is really a declaration of continuing the war as long as it takes, which was the G7 communique.
Thanks very much, Pravir. We'll leave it there for today. We're moving on, though, to a connected subject where also there has been no talk of peace, but a recent defense deal has been signed between the United States of America and Papua New Guinea. Of course, we've mentioned before on the show that U.S. President Joe Biden was set to visit Papua New Guinea, the first time any sitting US president would be in that part of the world, and meet with leaders of the Pacific Islands. That visit did not happen because of the ongoing debt crisis in the United States and domestic politics once again taking over concerns of engagement with these countries. However, the deal has been signed, and Anish will join us via video conference with the details of why actually students in Papua New Guinea, university students, even some school students, are on the streets protesting against this upcoming deal. Anish, if you look at the headlines in the English press today, you would imagine the US has won some kind of massive diplomatic victory through the signing of these deals, particularly with PNG, Papua New Guinea, for a defense deal essentially. But young students are on the streets of Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, protesting against this engagement between the two countries, raising concerns over the sovereignty of their nation when dealing with a country as large as the United States. The Prime Minister himself also said that countries like Papua New Guinea and the other Pacific Islands suffer when big nations are at play. So what are the key elements of the deals that have raised concerns both within PNG as well as outside?
Yeah, so it is quite interesting how students across universities, major universities in Papua New Guinea, has actually come out in protest, and this kind of, because we don't really often hear about the civil society in Papua New Guinea. It's very often under, even with the current set of reporting, you just get like a bare minimum line in certain news outlets talking about the protest. But other than that, there was pretty much no mention, even though it is probably one of the largest ones in recent years. The protest especially highlights the fact that this entire deal making business is extremely opaque. There is no, a draft copy that was released before the signing or even after the signing of the deal. And people pretty much do not know what the deal entails. And this is quite concerning for a whole lot of people because Papua New Guinea is one of those few countries that does not have any territorial dispute, even though the prime minister is talking about how territorial disputes are inevitable in the future as a defense or as a kind of an explanation for the deal. When the country has never had any kind of disputes with any of its neighbors to begin with. And also, it is one of those countries that has remained neutral in pretty much all foreign policy issues that have, or any kind of geopolitical battles that have happened in the region. And more importantly, it is a very strongly indigenous inhabited set of islands that we're talking about. And them being, run over by any kind of military base, we do not know if that is part of the deal, if there is going to be any kind of base making, if there is what kind of access the US is going to receive in the islands. We know nothing about it, and it is one of those concerns that the students in Papua New Guinea are actually bringing out right now. It is the fact that it is one of the most opaque security deals that we have seen in recent years in the region itself. Shows how problematic it can be in the long run.
Uh, we are also hearing of the typical untold billions of dollars in investment that will now flow in after these, yes, undoubtedly high profile set of visits, which included, of course, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi as well, going instead in some ways of Joe Biden, who cancelled his trip because of domestic issues like we talked about last week. Uh, China has had previous engagement with the region, has already established relationships. Uh, can we see this for the rest of the world from our perspective as anything more than the US kind of jostling for space in a region where, like I was saying, China already has some established relationships, ties in place, business ties as well?
Yeah, it is quite interesting to note how China is pretty much not giving out any statements so far about the deal as such. We see the Global Times, which is one of the state-run media houses, talking about how Biden had to cancel his visit and how it shows the complete lack of priority on the part of the U.S. But other than that, like the complete silence from China shows that China doesn't really see it as a major threat
Hmm.
as the US is trying to, or the mainstream media is trying to portray it as.
Make it out to be.
But we have to also remember that what Moresby's government, or sorry, the Papua New Guinea government, in fact, is actually one of the major trading partners in the region for China as well.
Hmm.
Like pretty much major investments, including a parliament house, was built because of China. And these facts cannot be overlooked. Something that Papua New Guinea's government, the prime minister, has also underlined the fact that he does not have any kind of concerns about China as of right now, and does not have, and like the current deal does not preclude any kind of deal making with China independently apart from this deal as well. So we do not exactly know how the current government is trying to balance this out, but definitely there is a balancing act, and that is necessitated, as you said, primarily because of the kind of the level of and the volume of engagement and trade and diplomacy that China has invested in the region. And this includes pretty much all of them, and this includes Australia and New Zealand, all of them. Even though you have governments, taking a very provocative stand in different periods of time, they at the end of the day they really cannot forget the fact that China is their biggest trading partner, and they require China for some of the as a key market for some of their major exports, and that simply cannot be overlooked. That cannot be bypassed with a couple of security deals with the US, which does not offer them that same level of market access, or for that matter investments into their economies either.
Hmm.
So this is something that the region understands very well. So even though there are deal makings and diplomatic activities all around, and we have seen, the high voltage of diplomatic activities in the past 2 years,
Hmm.
it is completely undeniable how all of these countries are very cautious when making statements, despite the kind of reporting that we see in the mainstream media. All of these nations are quite cautious, even when some of them say take a stand on the one China policy and break relations with Taiwan. Even at those times, they are very, very cautious of how they are going to approach the US and Chinese governments, the relationship with these two superpowers, essentially. And those facts cannot be changed. They are not going to be ones who will drag themselves into tensions very easily as of now, even if they have governments that are quite anti-Chinese. It's just not possible for them to push themselves into that kind of risk, where they might lose a major trading partner and just like risk bankruptcy or any kind of other issues in the long run. So these things will remain. That is the status quo we are looking at.
Mm,
despite all the activities that we're seeing right now. And that is something that the US is not accounting for, and neither of the war hawks in Washington or other parts of the world are actually accounting for, because the
mm,
fact is that they will continue to remain pragmatic in the long run,
mm.
despite the stand that their governments might take, the statements that they might make, or the deals that might happen in the short run.
Right. Case in point might be how, for example, climate change related concerns are the most pressing security need for the region, which is probably quite different from what their friends in Washington might be requiring. All right. Thanks very much, Anish, for joining us with those updates. The 76th World Health Assembly kicked off in Geneva a couple of days ago. The 10-day conference sees the participation of delegates from across the world, which include, of course, activists, civil society organizations, as well as journalists. They're all in the city to intervene and cover the event, including Jyotsna Singh of the People's Health Movement, who is there and will be reporting for us very soon. The World Health Assembly is taking place just after the DG of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, announced the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, of course, the WHO played a critical role in supporting health systems as they flagged and struggled, and some, of course, crumbled under the pressure of the pandemic. At the same time, the organization has also faced some serious internal issues caused by a lack of funding as well as interest from its member nations before the pandemic itself. That the WHO has managed to overcome some of these challenges and is continuing to at least have discussions on key global health issues is just one indicator that the UN's health agency is as important today as it was when it was created 75 years ago. Jyotsna, first up, why is it important for us to take note of what is not on the agenda of discussion this time around at the World Health Assembly?
So last week we had a workshop. People's Health Movement conducts these workshops every year just before the World Health Assembly, and what we do is that we discuss all the agenda items threadbare, and the resource persons join us from across the world, and we try to see what are the things that are going correct and what are the ones who are not going correct. And what came through was that even though there is a recognition that structural reasons impact people's access to healthcare, but in the documents you do not really see them. It doesn't come through as if the structural and the political and the economic reasons, which are beyond health per se, actually where a stand is being taken, um uh, the WHO is suggesting something to be done about it. So there is a separate agenda item which is called the social determinants of health, which is really good to talk about, and WHO is doing it, and we should appreciate it. And social determinants of health basically mean the social, cultural, and economic, or even geographical location of an individual or a community, which impacts its access to healthcare. So, for example, caste, gender, your geographical location, if you are in rural areas or even within rural areas, which part of the village you are at, and various things of this sort, when they start to matter, whether you will be able to access health and medicines and medical products and diagnostics or not. So WHO is talking about it separately about this. However, the point is, it is not a separate issue. It should cut across all agenda items when you discuss. So, be it universal health coverage, be it non communicable diseases, or infection prevention and control, or an agenda which is about persons with disabilities. All these things should have those structural issues embedded in. We do not see that happening, so which we think is a big problem. We also wrote an article, as you have mentioned, in People's Dispatch, and it does talk about these problems. The second point that emerged overall was that we do not see COVID 19, the learnings from COVID 19, becoming a part of these documents again. So, there is a pandemic treaty which is being discussed separately, international health regulations which guide responses to health emergencies, that is being discussed separately. I'm not going into the details for that. But it's not just that. We saw how the health systems collapsed overall, how we learned that what we need is a comprehensive health care understanding of health and healthcare, and not just nothing works in silos. So therefore, again in the documents we believe that WHO now should be more radical in talking about things, and those learnings of COVID-19, which went on for 3 years, and recently only WHO called has said that it is no more a public health emergency of international concern. But we have 3 years of experience that should come through the documents, and we see that is somewhere lacking. Although certain social determinants of health are being discussed, one cannot completely say no. For example, poliomyelitis, that is on the agenda. It does recognize that gender discrimination happens. So, gender is one uh, thing that you should need to look at when you give polio drops, or polio injections to children. So that's a good part. However, now other thing is, like again in our workshop, what we saw, if you look at them, so polio over the past few years has actually made a comeback. There were only 3 countries who had polio till few years ago, but now there are many more. Israel is there and many others. But when you start to superimpose the map where polio is spreading, uh, and put a map where the war and conflicts are happening in the world, you see they match. So war and conflict actually is one of the determinants of spread of polio. Polio spreads because of that. But that does not find any mention in the document. And obviously we know it happens because when there is conflict or war happening, you do not end up giving those drops to children for polio. So there are those issues.
Right, and you've been there now in Geneva for a couple of days. You've had the opportunity to, of course, listen to some of the key addresses that the assembly kicked off with, and also, I'm sure, to interact with journalists, delegates, activists from around the world. What is the mood like ahead of the actual sort of concrete discussions that are to come over the next 8 or 9 days?
So, oh yes, a lot has happened since yesterday in that sense. What we saw yesterday was, that is on Sunday, it was a opening ceremony, and a lot of presidents of various countries spoke. The India's premier spoke, and the president of and the premiers of many nations and former premiers. For example, Jacinda, the former premier of New Zealand, was there. So that happened, and Dr. Tedros also, who's the Director General of the World Health Organization, he also spoke yesterday. And also one thing is that, I mean, he does talk about equality. He does mention that there are a lot of things which need to be taken care of, and you know that he's and WHO overall has been quite committed to the tobacco control, the frame FCTC, the framework to control for tobacco control is there. So you heard all these things being talked about, but these are all good speeches. The agenda is the more comprehensive and intense agendas have just started to be discussed. The first agenda on issue is women's, children's, and adults and health. There is a global strategy which is being discussed, so we'll see where it goes. And so that so therefore there are 10 more days to go, and we'll see a lot of international politics unfold, and we will see a lot of discussions on health also happen.
All right, and with that, we bring to a close this episode of the Daily Debrief. As always, we encourage you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on these stories as well as all of the other work we do. We'll be back with another episode, same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.